All right, so I think that is it. We shall begin with today's session, and today we will be talking about some cognitive distortions. And basically, we'll be talking about some negative thinking patterns, or you can also call them the unhealthy thinking patterns that we usually have before before we have an unhealthy reaction to anything in our life. So we will be talking about uh, this today, and we'll be talking about how we yeah. So we'll be talking about how we can have an antidote, or you can say an alternate reaction, an alternative way of thinking, instead of those unhealthy or distorted thinking patterns. So before we begin, I am going to give you a few situations, right? Um, you don't have to analyze those situations. You just have to, just think about, and just not even think about it, because of course your thoughts are automatic when I tell you about that situation. You just have to notice the first response that comes to your mind when you think about it. When I tell you about it, what is the first response? Right? What comes to your mind when I tell you to imagine it? Now imagine that you send someone, an important message, and they see that message, right? We have this technology now that we get to know the moment someone sees our message, right? But they do not respond. They do not answer you, right? They do not respond to your message. And, you just feel how that makes you feel. Just notice what happens when you think about it, when you imagine that situation, right? A person is seeing your message, but they're not responding. You feel like they are ignoring you, right? What is your immediate reaction at that point? Now, just imagine, like in another situation, if we talk about it, um, you are sitting in a meeting, right? And you give your opinion about something, but you're ignored. Nobody responds to you, right? And the conversation moves on without any acknowledgement of what you shared. It just goes on and on without acknowledging your presence. What does that make you feel? What does your mind do about that situation? What does it tell you? Right? So, just a second. Okay, all right. So, what does that make you feel like? What happens in that moment? Maybe you start thinking about what you might have done differently if in order to be listened, in order to be heard, or maybe you don't feel anything at all. There are some people who don't feel bothered about it, right? Now, you might actually feel anxious, you might feel resentful, you might feel irritated, right? If it happens again and again, right? What happens? Whatever happens, in such a situation. The interesting part about all of this is that in none of these situations, we didn't consider what the other person is thinking, or what the other person might be doing, right? Our primary focus has been on what we think, on what we perceive of that situation. But we didn't really think about what the other person is thinking. We didn't talk about whether they were angry, whether they disliked our idea. Maybe that's why they ignored us, right? Um, maybe that conversation was going to be bad if your idea was considered. It was actually that bad. Now, your mind, however, it was filling the gaps. We didn't talk about it, but it was filling the gaps, right? You might be thinking that they're so rude. They are so rude to do that. Uh, they are so rude to be doing that, and they are so, um, you know, our minds actually makes justifications and or reasons like that. So that's the point I want you to notice when we come to situations like this. And try to close your eyes right now and try to imagine yourself in a situation like that. You are a part of a situation like that. And what is the conversation like? Now, all of that happened. You shared everything, you shared your idea, you were ignored, you are in the meeting, or you are texting someone and they're not responding. Now, I want you to take a deep breath in on a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it in for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. And exhale on a count of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's do it again. Inhale through your nose. Hold it in. And exhale from your mouth. Now, let's do it one more time. Inhale through your nose. And exhale through your mouth. You inhale through your nose and exhale through your mouth. So you don't have to open your eyes, and you just imagine at that certain point, now that you have calmed yourself down after that situation, how are you going to respond now? How are you going to think about that situation now? Do you want to think about the negative part of it, or you want to uh try to understand the other person's perspective and situation before you come to a conclusion? Your mind has the ability to complete an incomplete situation and create a story around it. We do that a lot of times. And whether that story is true or not true, accurate or inaccurate, our body reacts to that story as if it's a fact, right? So while you have your eyes closed, I want you to ask yourself, how quickly does my mind decide what something means? How quickly does it do that? Has it been ever in my life where my mind created a story, but it was not accurate? I want you to take a deep breath in through your nose and exhale from your mouth. Now I want you to open your eyes so we can talk more about this today. So we actually, often think about what, we how we react to what happens. Um, we think that we are reacting to a situation, reacting to what is happening, but there is usually a step in between we don't, you really consider. Something happens, we interpret it, then we react to that interpretation of that event rather than that event, right? If someone doesn't reply to your message, that's the event. And just a second. Yes, if someone doesn't reply to your message, that's an event, right? That's the event. They are upset with me, they are rude to me. That's the interpretation of it, right? So we are reacting to that interpretation by becoming anxious. We feel anxious. That is the emotional response to that. And then you might send another message, right? Or, withdraw, or you might become defensive, or you might start overthinking, right? This is the whole chain, the way it goes, right? You're not responding directly to the event. You are responding to its interpretation. Then you generate an emotional response to that interpretation, right? And then your behavior depends on that. So we're going to talk about cognitive reframing today. So we can, get past this this pattern of, thinking and creating, a negative interpretation of something and then the reacting to that. So let's begin today's discussion with what is cognitive reframing and how we can change the lens. So, cognitive reframing is basically learning to look at a situation through a different lens. It doesn't have to be always, all good and all positive, but just a realistic overview of a situation. Because our mind has, a negative bias. We always tend to, ignore the positive, uh, you know, uh, the signs and tend to look more towards the negative ones because, again, that's how the brain works usually. So we have to be very clear about this before we understand that reframe is not a positive thought process, right? And it also does not mean that you have to pretend that, something is wonderful. It doesn't have to be that. It's just a way, it's, when you are reframing something, it's actually an interpretation that is honest. You are being honest about the situation rather and being more balanced in your perception. Like you are looking through a camera. Situation has not changed, the camera is capturing things as they are, but then you tend to edit it, add filters and other things. That is the interpretation. But the camera in itself is taking a raw picture of the event. So cognitive reframing is taking a raw picture of the event by not filtering it, by not making it something it's not, by not, beautifying it. If the situation is bad, it is bad. But sometimes our mind tends to magnify the bad situation by making it the worst situation, right? So we have to look at it from a realistic and honest view. So the first type of, we're going to go through some of the types of distorted thinking, and we're going to discuss that and how we in these situations tend to rephrase the thoughts. So the first is catastrophizing. What is catastrophizing? Catastrophizing is when the mind assumes that the worst possible outcome is not just possible, but it is exactly what is going to happen, right? I have gotten an A in my biology class, but I got a C in my maths. I am always bound to, fail my maths exam, no matter what grade. And this is going to be my future, right? Like imagining, not just imagining a possible, you know, worst outcome, but actually believing that it is exactly what's going to happen. Now imagine if your boss is, if they're unusually quiet during a meeting. You you might immediately think that she or he, they're just planning to, let me go or fire me, right? So that is the worst, possible thought that come to your mind regarding your boss, that they're going to fire me, right? What is happening here? You went from a quiet meeting to losing your job within a second, right? Without even having any evidence for that conclusion. The brain, our brains, fortunately, they are filled in, in a huge, they have filled in a huge amount of information between the event and the conclusion. the interpretation we are making out of it. Now, in this scenario, how will you reframe? You can reframe by, saying, I don't actually, know whether there, what that silence actually meant. There are many possible explanations for that, and I'm choosing the worst one. I have no evidence for this, right? And that's you being honest about it. You're definitely not telling yourself everything is fine. There is something going on because the boss is unusually silent. But you're also not telling yourself that worst is going to happen. You are recognizing that you do not have enough information to know whether the worst explanation is true or not. So you have to ask yourself in the form of a practice, what evidence do I have about this? Number one, what evidence do I have about this? And the second is, what are the other possible explanations? What could be other reasons? What are the other possible explanations? Right? So this is how you can deal with catastrophizing. Now we have the all or nothing thinking, which means that either it's this or that, either it's good or bad, either it's success or failure. There is no in between. Either I am capable or I'm completely incapable. There is no in between. Now, if someone, they lose their temper once and they start immediately thinking, as mothers, we think about this very often, women, that I'm a terrible mother just because I lashed out on my child once. I'm a terrible mother. I may do everything else for the child. I may, cook food, take care of them. But just because I lashed out once, maybe I was overwhelmed. Maybe, some mothers who are going through postpartum depression and all of those conditions, they always, have such thoughts. They have such thoughts. Often they go like, I'm such a bad mother. There's something we call as the mom guilt. But that one moment is now turned into a verdict about your entire identity as a mother or a wife or a husband or a partner or a son or a daughter. How would you reframe such a thing? By practicing asking your question that is this 100% true? Is this actually 100% true? Or I'm collapsing a complex situation into a binary. I just had a difficult moment. That is one data point. That's it. I had it twice. That there are two data points. Let's see. But there are countless other data points that I'm not able to, conclude my, verdict upon. I'm just concluding it on one single event. So this is the way you can practice it. Is this 100% true, or am I actually collapsing a complex situation into binary? Then the third one we're going to discuss is mind reading. When we assume we know what another person is thinking by being sure about it, choosing, usually we are choosing the worst possible explanation. That they're definitely, upset with me. I am sure. I know they are upset with me. Do you actually know? Okay, she has not replied to my text. That's it. Everything else that you are about to, think about this situation is your interpretation. It is what your mind has added. It is not reality. Right? I'm filling a blank with the worst case scenario. I don't actually know what she's thinking, right? So again, in such a situation, because it's much similar to, catastrophizing, because in that is not, restricted to how we perceive someone is thinking. Mind reading is more restricted to how we believe that we know what certain person is thinking. So how do you challenge this? What do I actually know for certain? What am I adding that I do not know? That distinction can actually, save you from reacting to something that may not even be happening. So this is the way you can challenge, when it comes to mind reading. Now, what about personalization? Personalization is the fourth cognitive distortion we're going to discuss. When we take responsibility for something that was not even entirely ours, sometimes not even ours to begin with, right? Not even small amount of responsibility goes on us, but still we associate the responsibility, excuse me, of whatever happened to our own selves. Now, imagine if, there is party where you went and something didn't go well, right? The evening wasn't that good. And you keep on thinking that the whole evening was, it was ruined because of my bad mood. Maybe your mood was, one of the things, one of the factors. But when you are personalizing something, you are actually saying the whole of the thing happened because of me. There were other people as well. They had their own moods, their own choices, their own reactions, their own behaviors. But you are putting all the blame on your own self. So, in such a situation, how would you deal with it? What would you do in that situation? You can tell yourself, that what part of this was actually mine. You can assess the whole event, the whole evening, and try to ask yourself what part was actually mine and what part actually belonged to other people. Rather than coming to a verdict, start doing an analysis of the event, of the evening. The analysis can actually save you from, coming to conclusions that are not completely right, that are not actually true, right? So you have to do a analysis of what was your fault to begin with and what was the fault of other people, rather than directly jumping to a verdict, right? So these are four of the, you can say, cognitive distortions that we have gone through today. Tomorrow we will be discussing some more, about 5 to 6 more cognitive distortions, and how we can, actively reframe them from a practical perspective, rather than, as I said in the beginning, um, cognitive reframing does not mean turning your thoughts into positive ones, even if there are no positive, sides to it. So we have to um, properly analyze the situation, right? And try to understand which part is actually being added by our mind instead of it being the reality, right? So let's do a small, self-reflection activity before we can, call it a day. So, about all of these, actually, before we go to reflection, all of these, reframes that we do in all of these four, I think so we discussed four. None of these actually tell you that everything is fine. They don't even tell you to ignore what happened, right? Ignoring and suppression, we have been addressing this in our sessions, that suppression is never going to solve a problem. It's going to delay it, and at times it's going to magnify the intensity of it. It's not going to remove the problem or solve the problem. So we don't say everything is fine when everything is not fine, right? And we don't ignore if everything is not fine. We address it, right? None of the ways we learn about reframing and the ones we will learn tomorrow, none of them tell you to, just shift yourself to a positive mindset like people tell you. To be very positive, be positive about it. Don't think negative, right? We don't do that with reframing. Reframing is a healthier alternative, right? You are just asking yourself to stop adding information you don't have, right? If you don't have any evidence about something, do not add certain information to a story. That's what makes reframing different from suppression, right? It brings you back to what is known, right? Something that is not tested is not something known. If there is no evidence, there is no, it's not the reality, right? So you're not ignoring it, but you're assessing it from the point of view of how many evidences exist about a certain information. So if you don't have it, you you do not add it to the story. So what is your responsibility? Not to think positively, but to think more accurately. Accuracy is the target. Now, as we sign off, I want you to, think about one situation from, a recent time where your reaction was more strong than you expected, or where you actually, found yourself replaying something again and again, even after the situation has gone. It could be anything, right? Now, once you have thought about it, you can, take your phone or a pen or a paper and write down the thought that comes afterwards, immediately afterwards. What was your mind actually, saying in that situation? Write that down exactly as it is. And then try to identify from the patterns we discussed, which of these patterns we discussed today might be present in your thoughts. Maybe you might be catastrophizing, mind reading, personalizing, right? Or taking all the blame. And then start to reframe that thought about that imaginary situation you had recently. You ask yourself, am I assuming? What else could be true? What could be a more accurate and useful way of looking at this? Take a moment and write that down. And you don't have to be artificially positive. I'm saying it again and again. You don't have to be positive when you cannot be, right? Make it believable. Something you could, actually say to yourself when you're having a bad time. And then put your both thoughts that you initially had and the one you reframed and created after the analysis, and assess which one makes more sense, which is more convincing. Of course, usually the original thought is the one that feels more convincing. That's completely normal. Again, I said our thoughts, our brain is, wired in a way that we tend to move towards the negative ones, but we can rewire it by practicing these things, by practicing reframing. Because the thought patterns, the negative thought patterns you have repeated for years and years and years, repetition, they become embedded in your brain, but they are changeable by practicing the healthier way, not the positive, but the healthier way, right? When you practice this different way of interpreting the situation, you might be able to get past those emotional reactions that come as a result of an interpretation and not the event itself. So that is it for now. Does anybody have any questions or wants to share something? They can share it in the chat box, as we can call it a day. All right, I think that is it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. I hope to see you all tomorrow. Have a great day ahead. Bye-bye.